So, you've decided that you want to try your hand at game mastering TTRPGs. Maybe you've watched a live play like Critical Role or Dimension 20 and you want to try to capture some of that magic for yourself. There's just one problem. Where do you start? TTRPGs are so big and they're so grand in scale. How can you convince 4 of your friends to commit to something that will take so long? The nice thing is, you don't have to. Today, we're going to break down some baby steps to help you develop your skill set as a game master so that you can become one of the greats like Matt Mercer or Brennan Lee Mulligan. Hi, I'm John, this is Dragonmind, and today we're going to be breaking down the 7 baby steps to masterful game mastering. Let's get into it. Before we start into the 7 baby steps proper, I think it's good to first establish why most new game masters feel like they fail in their first few sessions. I find that most new game masters make the common mistake of trying to go too big too fast. Like Critical Role or Dimension 20, I feel like they envision this long-form story with emotionally invested players and detailed, intricate lore. Even assuming that your particular players want this, which in my experience a lot of them don't, oftentimes your schedules are not conducive to this kind of approach. Even if you as a GM can get a few friends together to try your ongoing campaign, oftentimes the game fizzles within a few sessions, and the GM feels like their game was a failure as a result. The 7 baby steps have been designed to address this directly. Your goal is to figure out which storytelling structure is best going to fit your players' particular schedules, and then develop some of the storytelling and world-building techniques that are going to make your game come to life. So, without further ado, let's dive into them. Baby step 1 is to run a one-shot. If you're a new GM, I recommend beginning with a simple story that has a beginning, middle, and end that's told and wrapped up within a single session. You don't want any cliffhangers, you don't want to seed the next adventure, you don't want to point forward toward next time. You want to spend as much time making this one session as awesome as it can be. Especially if this is your first time, I find the simpler the better. Your main goal for running a one-shot is to keep your focus on your player characters and how they're telling the story. I tend to follow a pretty predictable one-dimensional formula for this kind of thing. If it's a fantasy RPG, something like your party comes upon a village and there's a monster attacking the farms, so the player characters have to go defeat the monster. Very simple, very boilerplate. For a lot of individuals, they may even criticize that this sounds really boring or one-dimensional. And yeah, if that was the story you were telling, maybe. But I find that stories like this always get spiced up from the unique ideas and contributions of your players. They'll find ways to make it unique and their own, as long as you give them the space to do it. This really helps you discover your own style and preferences. Are you drawn to the characters that really take their role-playing seriously? Or are you a GM that gets really excited when some kind of goofy, silly solution comes up? The other reason to start with a self-contained one-shot is because it has very elegant off-ramps built into it. What I mean by that is, let's say that particular players at your table don't gel. There are many times where your real-life group of friends gets along really well. But as soon as you start playing a TTRPG, suddenly there's all this unexpected conflict. One player is all about the story and the emotional investment, but another player is making jokes and metagaming and maybe creating an overpowered character. If your particular group just doesn't gel well, there's no expectation they have to commit any more time together. Instead, you play out the session, you set it aside, and you try again maybe with a different configuration of players. if you didn't like the way that you ruled a particular session, or maybe the story went in a direction that you didn't like, or for whatever reason you were dissatisfied with how the game went, by keeping it a one-shot, you have the freedom to ignore the events of whatever happened and start again fresh next time. And if things go really well, everyone likes their characters, they want to try to continue their stories, you have the option to build on those events. Just don't go in planning for that to be the case. You want the expectation to be that this story will be a self-contained closed loop that could also be built on, but could also just kind of be set aside if it's most appropriate that way. A lot of new GMs will find it tempting to want to start to launch the players into some ongoing story. They may also be tempted to overcomplicate the story or add too many details. The most effective new GMs I've seen are ones where they keep the story simple and they celebrate how their players approach the problems instead of driving it themselves. Your number one goal is to close that story loop within that single session and maintaining your focus on keeping your players playing, not just listening to you ramble on about lore or descriptions. Baby step number 2 is to run a story arc. For our purposes, a story arc is some kind of story that can't be resolved in a single session. Usually it takes between 2 and 4. While I view baby step 1 as creating simple one-shots that are more backdrops and contexts for the player's stories, story arcs are where you as a GM get to step up and really start refining your storytelling skills. You figure out the timing of cliffhangers, maybe you foreshadow certain events, or play with having some kind of twist. Maybe the quest giver was the villain all along. The key thing I found is for story arcs to land properly, they require a certain level of player engagement. For example, the big reveal that Darth Vader is Luke's father is not that emotionally impactful in a vacuum. However, for audiences in the 70s that were amazed and blown away by the special effects of Star Wars episodes 4 and 5, and had the setup and the expectation that Darth Vader had killed Luke's father, it was a mind-blowing emotional revelation when Darth Vader made his iconic proclamation. If you're having a hard time keeping your players attentive and off of their phones, story arcs may not end up being super appropriate. Again, scheduling is a concern here. For example, the first time I ran Dragon Heist, I ran it as 4 5-hour sessions, each session covering a chapter from the campaign. However, the sessions in real time were spaced really far apart. Sometimes we'd go 2 or 3 months without playing. At the start of each session, the players had already forgotten everything that had been built up by the session prior. And so, each session had less emotional impact than if we were able to play out the same story arc with the sessions closer together and with players that could remember all of the little details. One thing I do want to clarify is that, like you, players can also develop the skill set, especially if you're being attentive as their guide. Even if players normally don't pay attention to little details, there are ways that you can set up your game to train them to do so. Just because your players aren't there yet doesn't mean they'll never be, which is why we're taking this in baby steps. It might be that you still need to run some one-shots, and maybe each one-shot has its own little twist, so your players can be on the lookout for them. Then, when everyone is ready, that's when your table as a group can move on to running story arcs. Baby step 3 is where we actually run a campaign. If you really distill it down, a campaign is just a really long story arc. For tables looking for deep characterization, meaningful payoffs, and emotional catharsis, a campaign is going to be the format that can make all of those things happen. You can still get them in smaller chunks in one-shots and story arcs, but it's not gonna have the same hit as a long-form campaign. Now, you may be asking what the difference between a story arc or a campaign is. For me, it comes down to the amount of time that you're playing and the power span of the characters. For example, some may consider Dragon Heist from 5th edition to be a campaign. To me, it ended up feeling more like a story arc because it didn't take very many sessions to conclude the story. The power level of the characters was also pretty contained. It only brought them between levels 1 and 5. But something like Tyranny of Dragons, which brings them from levels 1 all the way to 15, from becoming humble greenhorn adventurers all the way to casting 7th and 8th level spells, there was a lot more transformation that happened over the course of that story. The key lesson to learn about running a campaign is keeping up momentum. What can happen is the same group that can be really excited for the first 10 sessions of a campaign can slowly start to lose their engagement if events take too long to happen. As a GM, and one thing you learn from running one-shots, is timing and a feeling of meaningful progression. You want each session to feel like it matters, and not like the story is just dragging on. A lot of GMs that start with longer form campaigns never really get this lesson, and their campaigns fizzle because not enough things are happening for the time commitment the players are putting in. In addition, there's an even greater temptation for the campaign story to revolve around your world or your villain. And so it's more important than ever to have the focus be on the player characters and the story that they're telling. Once you move beyond baby step 3, I don't even know if I'd really consider you a new GM anymore. You might be tackling some of these other skills for the first time, and we'll have completely other videos to address them in depth. But I do want to touch on the last 4 baby steps, because I believe this is where a lot of GMs kind of focus their time. Whereas for me, I found that the GMs that I enjoyed playing with the most were ones that figured out the ideal structure and time commitment that the real world players had to make in order to get the most out of the time they were spending together. Baby step 4 is all about growing your world. This is where you start to tip into world building. World building is a huge, expansive topic that I will never have enough time to cover everything about. It's a world unto itself. There are so many things to talk about with it, so many techniques to discuss. I couldn't possibly cover it even in a single video. However, the one little piece of advice I'd like to leave in this progression is it's called world building, not world built. It's not about creating this huge setting that you then dump on your players all at once. It's about slowly and patiently immersing them in the setting so your players can roleplay characters that could reasonably live there. Immersion is also a permission-based thing. Not every player actually wants to be immersed. Some of them actually like having a healthy emotional distance between them and their characters. So while world building can be a layer of GMing that can bring your game from good to great, if it's done so without collaborating or clearly communicating with your players, a lot of times it can actually drive some players away. You can test out if world building is right for your particular table by referencing far-off conflicts or historical events. If your players seem really interested in it and keep asking specific questions to learn more about the world, there's a good chance that world building is going to be an asset that will amplify the enjoyment at your table. Baby step 5 is to cultivate your table's culture. Now, there will be a lot of community members that would argue that one of the most important things to do before starting is to have a session 0. I think session 0s definitely have their place in making sure that everybody is both safe and adhering to the different agreements that will make the game work the best. However, the reason I'm not starting this progression with a session 0 topic is because before you can lead others, you really need to cultivate yourself. Whether you like it or not, when you're a game master, you are the leader of your table. And to know who you are, sometimes you just need to get started. Instead of dwelling on making sure everything is perfectly set up and then crumbling when something goes wrong, sometimes you just need to give it a try. And you may even find that game mastering is something you don't enjoy. Another reason to start with one-shots, because if you don't like it, there's no expectation that you need to continue. However, once you become confident as a game master, the next step is to start to clarify your vision of the best game you could run and who the players can be to make that vision come to life. With Baby Step 5, you're not making justifications about anything that's happening in-game, you're not really talking about mechanics, you're acknowledging the humans around the table as humans, and working together to create strong social contracts that will make the game as best as it can be. Not every table is interested in that, which is why this is so far down the list. But I do find that the best games are the ones where everybody is respectful and compassionate and trusting and patient. And the best way to encourage those qualities is to embody them yourself. Personally, what I started with at my table is the 4 agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz. Be impeccable with your word, don't take things personally, don't make assumptions, always do your best. Now, part of culture can also be the in-game things. How much does our group value following the rules versus ignoring rules? If there's a conflict between a storytelling moment and a mechanic, which one are we going to go for? I'm not saying that there's a right answer, but there's probably going to be a right answer for your particular table. And when things go wrong, because things will go wrong, who's the person you want to be? And who are the people that you want your players to be? A lot of times, just asking those questions can lead to some pretty powerful answers. Baby step 6 is tune the system. Again, for lots of members of the community, it might sound like blasphemy that homebrew is this far down the list. And it's because in my experience, the best implemented homebrew is done from a very clear place of where the table wants to be culturally. The best homebrew accentuates what the table likes about a game and downplays what players don't. Also, there are a lot of tables that get along just fine with the rules as written. I myself GM'd like that for a really long time. Over time though, I did find that by adhering to the mechanics as written, the extra little bit that brought my games from being great to excellent couldn't be bridged without some kind of adjustment to the game's base system. That being said, I'm really glad that I spent as much time GMing with the rules as written as I did, because I've also had experiences where GMs that aren't as familiar with the base system try to implement homebrew, and they actually make the game worse as a result. Sometimes they would throw in maybe an overpowered spell or an overpowered subclass that would functionally make the rest of the players kind of useless in combat. It was supposed to add some kind of story element, but it just made the game less fun to play. And also, sometimes when you implement homebrew, it also has some unforeseeable effects. For example, one of the variant rules that I played with in 5th edition for a while was flanking. But after a while, I actually read up on facing and started implementing it at my tables. While many of you may think of this as a mechanical addition, which it definitely is, the difference is that it actually made the storytelling a lot better. For example, because we were tracking facing, I knew what every creature's line of sight was. It made tactics like hiding and ambushing much more viable and a lot clearer to resolve. Players would start to do things like try to distract an enemy so that their ally could sneak behind and get advantage on their attacks. It made my players fight a lot more descriptively, and as a result got them much more engaged when we rolled initiative. However, I could definitely see how that particular rule could be confusing or overwhelming for other tables, which is why homebrew is meant to tune the system. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution. It has to do with your individual players, what they like about the game, and how to get the best possible experience. Which brings us to baby step 7. Know when to step back, know when to step forward. One of the most difficult lessons as a GM is knowing when to shut up. If you do your job well as the leader, and you set up a space where your players are creatively collaborating, bouncing off each other, coming up with unique scenes, dialogue, and scenarios, sometimes by you starting to talk more, it's not going to add to the scene. It's in fact going to disrupt it. I find the games as a GM I enjoy the most are ones where maybe I'm talking like 10% of the time to answer any questions or respond as an NPC. But the players are the real drivers of the story. They're communicating with each other, playing off each other, developing each other. That being said, there are still some times where those players will get stuck. And as a GM, by speaking up or stepping forward into the leadership role, you can dissolve whatever blockage is keeping things from moving. Another good example is, what happens when your players want to become GMs themselves? You have to know when to step back into the player seat and let them become leaders at the table and make their own mistakes and get their own insights. After all, this was the thought experiment that got me started on this channel to begin with. The thing I love most about this baby step is it goes beyond game mastering. It's a skill that you can hone in this kind of lighter play environment. But let's say you're at your job. Sometimes you have to know when it's time to speak up. Other times, you have to know when it's time to shut up so that you can listen to what other people are saying. It's just one way how we can discover our best selves through gaming. So now I want to hear what all of you have to say. What's your game mastering journey been like? If you're a new GM, did you find this 7-step process helpful? If you're a GM looking at these baby steps, which one do you think you could use a little more work on? Let us know in the comments down below. Hit like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell. Have an awesome day, and remember, your story matters. Bye-bye now.